Lecture 15, Aristophanes.
Welcome back to Lecture 15. In this lecture, we're going to return to Athenian dramatic literature, and we will look at comedy in Athens, and particularly at the works of the great comic playwright Aristophanes. Tragedy was not the only theatrical genre that came into full flower in the 5th century in Athens. This is also the time period when comedy developed. As is the case with tragedy, we don't know exactly what the origins of comedy were or precisely what its association with Dionysus may have been. Comedies, like tragedies, were performed at festivals of Dionysus, so they were in some sense connected with the god, but the origins both of the connection and of the genre itself are obscure. The Greek word for comedy, komoidia, almost definitely derives from the word komos, which means a band of revelers, a group of revelers or partiers, people running around through the streets having a good time. And komoidia, from which we get comedy, probably means komos song, song of a band of revelers. If this etymology for comedy is correct, there's no specific connection with Dionysus, obvious there. But Aristotle, writing in the 4th century, says in his work Poetics that comedy derived from early phallic processions in honor of Dionysus, that is, processions through the street in which the people in the procession carried large images of an erect phallus, and this was done in honor of Dionysus. Now, the actors of comedy, we know, wore as part of their costume a large padded phallus. Bizarre though that seems, it's true, they did. And this offers some evidence for a connection with these phallic processions. Aristotle may have gotten that right. Whatever its origins or connections with Dionysus, competitions in comedy were added to the city Dionysia in 486. So throughout the 5th century, comic playwrights entered plays into competition at the city Dionysia alongside the tragedians. And competitions in comedy were added to another festival of Dionysus, the Lenaea, from about 440 onward. Before the Peloponnesian War, 5 comedies were performed per competition. During the war, the number may have been reduced to 3. We're not entirely sure about that. Now, our attempts to reconstruct the development of comedy are hampered by the fact that the earliest surviving play, Aristophanes' Acharnians, dates to 425, so well after the time when comedy was performed first in Athens. And even more importantly, Aristophanes is the only 5th century comedian any of whose works have survived complete. So we've got 2 problems there, a gap of 60 years between comedy's inclusion in the city Dionysia and our first extant comedy. That makes it difficult to know what early comedy was like, although there is as large a gap between the traditional date of the beginning of tragedy. If you remember, Thespis supposedly put on the first tragedy in 534. Our first extant play by Aeschylus, The Persians, dates to 472, so there's about a similar gap there. But more importantly, since we have so little with which to compare Aristophanes' work, it's very difficult to say with certainty which features belong inextricably to comedy as a genre and which are simply elements of Aristophanes' own style. With tragedy, at least we have the 3 great tragedians to compare to one another, which gives us more of a sense of the overall genre and the individual author's own style. With comedy, we have Aristophanes for the 5th century, and then we have some fragments of other comedians. So it's difficult to talk about the development of comedy before Aristophanes. Scholars generally divide Athenian comedy into 3 forms from Aristophanes on: Old, Middle, and New comedy. The only complete examples of both Old and Middle comedy are by Aristophanes. There are fragments from other authors for both genres, but Aristophanes is our only complete exemplar of either Old or Middle comedy. We'll discuss Menander and New comedy in Lecture 17. And for most of this lecture, I'm going to concentrate on Old comedy because that's the bulk of what Aristophanes has left us. Old comedy, in effect, in its most basic definition, means comedies produced in the 5th century. But there are some characteristics of its form and its subject matter that distinguish it from later comedies. And both these elements, form and subject matter, are important for our understanding of the genre of old comedy. Like tragedy, comedy featured all male casts. And the chorus in old comedy was of primary importance. The chorus probably consisted of 24 members compared to the 12 or perhaps 15 of tragedy. And several old comedies, Aristophanes and others, were named for their choruses. In Aristophanes' work, think of Acarnians, that is, men from Acarnia, Babylonians, clouds, knights, all of those are named for the characters of their choruses. The chorus was frequently costumed as animals in old comedy. So, for instance, 3 of Aristophanes' plays, Birds, Frogs, and Wasps, feature choruses that are costumed as, well, birds, frogs, and wasps. Most of Aristophanes' extant comedies need 4 actors to perform all the roles, compared to the 3 actors of tragedy. In comedy, as in tragedy, the actors were masked, so one actor could play more than one role without confusion. Old comedy included fixed elements of form, which appear in all our examples of the genre. The 2 most important formal elements were the agone and the parabasis. Agone, literally struggle or contest, is where we get our word agony from. Agone is a dialogue, a dispute, an argument between 2 characters sometimes, or 2 groups of characters. The parabasis, the other main formal element, is a choral section near the midpoint of an old comedy where the action of the storyline stops and the chorus speaks directly to the audience, often in the playwright's voice, sometimes using the first person singular. The parabasis is always in a particular meter called anapests, which is the opposite of the dactyl of dactylic hexameter. A dactyl is long, short, short, and anapest is short, short, long. That's the characteristic meter of the parabasis. Now, these fixed formal elements, and there are several others in old comedy, do not imply that old comedy as a genre was rigid or limited in its approach. Within the fixed structure, there was a great deal of room for invention and for flights of fancy on the part of the playwright, and old comedy's subject matter took full advantage of this. The subject matter of old comedy tends toward the fantastic, the bizarre, the grotesque. For instance, in Frogs, the god Dionysus journeys to the underworld to bring back a dead tragedian. In Clouds, Socrates swings from a basket in midair to try to study the sun. Birds features a society of birds, usually translated as Cloud Cuckoo Land, that is a kind of parallel to Athenian society. In the play Peace, the main character tries to ride an enormous dung beetle up to Mount Olympus. As you see, this is not realistic drama, fantastic and even grotesque, outlandish plots. But these outlandish, ridiculous, wild plots were nevertheless a means of discussing important political and social realities. The scholar Geoffrey Henderson puts it this way: these comedies, quote, typically depict Athens in the grip of a terrible and intractable problem, e.g. the war, bad political leaders, an unjust jury system, dangerous artistic or intellectual trends, which is solved in a fantastic but essentially plausible way, often by a comic hero, close quote. So like comedy in so many cultures and at so many times, Aristophanes' comedy and old comedy in general, while it was extremely funny, at times slapstick, ludicrous in its plot, nevertheless has this serious core of the discussion of important political and social and cultural issues of the day. The comedies include, as part of that, a great deal of pointed satire of well-known individuals and public figures, often in extremely bawdy and scatological terms. This is not a polite genre. Now, Aristophanes, as I've said, is our only surviving writer of old comedy, or let me put that another way around, he's not surviving. He's the only writer of old comedy whose works have survived to some extent, but we don't know much about his life. He was probably born no earlier than 460 and no later than 450, and he probably died in or around 386, but those dates are uncertain. 11 of his plays are extant. We know that he wrote at least 32 others. So that means we have a much larger percentage of his work than we do of the 3 great tragedians. 11 out of 43 is much, much better than 7 out of Sophocles' 120, for instance. Of the 11 extant plays, the 9 old comedies that have survived were all written during the Peloponnesian War. And if you think back to what I said about the Peloponnesian War's effect on Athens in the last lecture, you can see why these comedies would have very serious political and social commentary at the heart of them. This was not a good time in Athens. Aristophanes won at least 6 first prizes and at least 4 second prizes, so he was quite successful. Political commentary, particularly directly concerning the Peloponnesian War, permeates most of the surviving 9 old comedies of Aristophanes. One of the clearest examples of this, which I don't have time to talk about, unfortunately, I'll just mention, is Lysistrata, where the women of Athens and Sparta together agree upon a sex strike until their husbands will end the war. That's perhaps the most commonly performed of Aristophanes' plays today. It's always topical, I suppose. Aristophanes' parabases, that's the plural of parabasis, tend to single out individual politicians for ridicule. And remember, these politicians were probably right there in the audience. So he wouldn't just be talking theoretically, he'd point at someone and hold him up to ridicule. It was a very direct kind of political commentary. Aristophanes' plays also very frequently satirize other playwrights, comedians and tragedians both, and intellectual and philosophical movements. Several plays make fun of some of the conventions of tragic stagecraft, and Euripides in particular also comes in for mockery based on his tragic plots and the style of his writing. Now, what I want to do for the rest of this lecture is focus on just 2 of Aristophanes' plays, Clouds and Frogs. Talk about them in that order. Clouds first, which is a satire on philosophical and educational trends of the time, and then Frogs, which makes fun in part of tragedy, but also has some very serious things to say about tragedy and tragedians. So starting with Clouds. Clouds placed last, it was not a success, at the City Dionysia of 423. The text of the play we have is a later unperformed revision from 418. So whatever was wrong with it in 423, Aristophanes rewrote it, but apparently never produced the rewritten version. In Clouds, Aristophanes pokes fun at a group of philosophers called sophists. Now, the sophists were a group of itinerant teachers in Athens who specialized in teaching rhetoric and especially in teaching forms of argumentation. They were both very popular and very worrisome in 5th century Athens. They espoused a naturalistic and relativistic view of morality and of religion, or at least they apparently did. None of their works survive in more than the smallest fragments. Most of our information about the sophists comes from people who did not like them, so it's a little bit difficult to reconstruct what exactly their approach was. Their opponents accused them of corrupting morals and weakening religious beliefs. And one charge against them was that they taught young men to make the worse or weaker argument appear better or stronger. You can translate the Greek either way. They taught young men to make the worse argument appear better or to make the weaker argument appear stronger. Now, apparently what they did that caused this charge was they taught young men to argue either side of an issue, standard debating technique. But it was worrisome to the 5th century Athenians because it seemed to dismoor a man's rhetorical skill from what he thought was true. And if you have a speaker who can argue perfectly persuasively something that is false in the assembly when you're going to vote on important issues such as going to war or not, if you have speakers who can persuasively argue false statements, then how do you know whom to trust and whom not to trust? But at the same time, the sophists were extremely popular as teachers of rhetoric, especially among those who aspired to speak in the assembly. They were useful, but they were also considered dangerous. Clouds paints an extremely funny, though probably inaccurate portrait of the great philosopher Socrates. Now, Socrates was not a sophist, but Aristophanes lumps him in with them nevertheless. Socrates differed from the sophists in many ways. For one thing, he did not accept money for teaching. It was considered rather shocking that the sophists did accept money for teaching, nor did he ever found a school. In Plato's Apology, which we'll talk about briefly in the next lecture, Socrates mentions the play Clouds and repudiates the picture of him that was given there. But for Aristophanes' purposes, probably, Socrates was the best-known philosopher of the time and therefore an easy target to satirize. If you've seen one pointy-headed intellectual, you've seen them all. The one who's best known is the one that you use as a main character in your play. Now, the plot of Clouds features a farmer, Strepsiades, who wants his extravagant son Phidippides to receive a sophistic education because Phidippides' spending habits are such that Strepsiades knows the young man is going to end up sued for unpaid debts over and over again. So Strepsiades' brilliant idea is get the boy educated as a sophist, and then he can talk him his way out of the lawsuits that he will inevitably encounter. At first, Phidippides refuses to cooperate. He doesn't want to go to school and become a sophist. And so Strepsiades decides to get an education himself. Strepsiades goes to a school called the Frontisterion, which is usually translated as the Thinkery, where he meets several students and finally Socrates himself. The students are engaged in all sorts of absurd pseudoscientific problems, including figuring out how many flea feet a flea can jump by making little wax booties to put on the flea's feet and then measuring the jump with the booties, and trying to figure out whether gnats' humming sound is made through their mouths or through their rumps. Socrates first appears in the play suspended in a basket in midair. He's studying astronomical and meteorological phenomena, so he's got to be up in the air to look at the things of the air. Strepsiades enrolls as a pupil in the Thinkery, and Socrates tries to instruct him in the basics of the education given there. The result is a ludicrous caricature of current philosophical, scientific, and linguistic theory. Strepsiades simply cannot understand anything that Socrates tells him. He gets it all absurdly wrong. And Socrates displays his religious unorthodoxy by praying to the clouds as goddesses. The chorus enters in costume as clouds, which gives the play its name. After the Clouds' Parabasis, in which they claim, rather indignantly, that this is Aristophanes' best play, and the fact that it came in last was a mistake, Socrates tries to find out what Strepsiades wants to learn. Strepsiades wants to become a skilled speaker, but he's absolutely hopeless at it. Socrates eventually gives up in despair on Strepsiades and recommends that he go back to his original plan and enroll his son Phidippides instead. Now, when Strepsiades brings his son Phidippides to the Thinkery, the personified better and worse argument enter and engage in an agon in which they each make the case for their own style of education. Aristophanes identifies the better argument with old-style education, traditional education, the worse argument with modern, sophistic education. And this agon between the two forms of learning encapsulates the very serious issues that lie behind the comedy of Clouds. What form of education, traditional or sophistic, will produce the best citizens? What form of education will best help Athens produce good citizens who might be able to find their way out of this terrible war we're in? Even more broadly than that, what is the appropriate reaction to the kind of intellectual challenge presented by the sophists and by others like them? To quote Jeffrey Henderson again, in Clouds, Aristophanes created a true comedy of ideas that captured the perhaps ineluctable essence of a cultural dilemma that worried thinking Athenians and even in our own day has yet to be resolved. This dilemma can be stated rather simply. When a society suddenly generates serious intellectual challenges to the norms and beliefs that over long periods of time have given it cohesion and stability, how should people react? Close quote. The sophists are there. They are challenging a great many cultural norms and realities. How should a society react to that? Throw them out? Execute them? Ignore them? Decide that they're right and our own traditional culture has been wrong all along? It's not an easy question. And as Henderson says, it's a dilemma that has yet to be resolved even in our own day. Now, since Clouds is a comedy, the result of Phidippides' sophistic education is wildly absurd. He becomes so good a sophist that he makes a coherent argument for the right of sons to beat their fathers, and puts this into action by giving his father Strepsiades a good thrashing. Strepsiades is, understandably, aghast at the result of his son's education, and he reproaches the clouds for misleading him. They had recommended the thinkery to him. He says to them, "You misled me. Look what the result is." The clouds, in a rather serious speech, respond that Strepsiades himself chose to do wrong when he wanted an education for his son so that his son could cheat his creditors. So the clouds say, you went into this with an incorrect desire to be able to cheat your creditors, therefore you have no one to blame but yourself for whatever the result may be. And infuriated, Strepsiades sets out to burn down the thinkery. Socrates and the other pupils run out of the burning building and the play ends. This, by the way, is another very, very puzzling element of stagecraft that theater historians try to figure out, just like Ajax's suicide in Sophocles' Ajax or the earthquake in Euripides' Bacchae. What exactly happened when Strepsiades tried to burn down the thinkery at the end of Clouds? There was a wooden building, a wooden scene building at the back of the acting area in the Greek theater, but surely Aristophanes was not allowed to set it on fire. So how this was staged, we simply don't know. It's another one of those problems that we would like to know, but we don't. Now, Aristophanes' play Frogs, which is my personal favorite among his plays, was performed in 405 BC, so just the year before the end of the Peloponnesian War, the year after the death of Sophocles and Euripides. It also addresses social and political problems of the day. It makes fun not of philosophers, but of tragedians. Like Clouds, Frogs is extremely funny. It holds up well in performance, even in our very different culture today. But like Clouds, it also has some extremely serious issues at its core. The setup of the play is that the god Dionysus descends to Hades to bring back Euripides, who has just died. There are two extant plays, in which Dionysus actually appears as a character. Bacchae is one of them, Frogs is the other. Dionysus wants to save Athens, he says. That's a very serious desire on his part. He wants to save Athens, and to do this he needs a tragedian, but all the great tragedians are dead. Sophocles and Euripides have just died the year before. All the great tragedians are dead, so Dionysus is going to take a journey down to the underworld and bring back Euripides, he says, as the play begins. But the play quickly turns into a contest between Euripides and Aeschylus over which one of them should be resurrected. Sophocles is not a contestant. There are a couple of issues to think about there. Apparently, Aristophanes had pretty well finished the play before Sophocles died. Then Sophocles died, and Aristophanes had to write in just a line or two about how Sophocles has just arrived down here in the underworld. When Dionysus asks someone in the underworld if Sophocles doesn't want to claim the chair of tragedy that Aeschylus has had since 456, Euripides has come in and said, "Give me the chair." Dionysus asks, doesn't Sophocles want the chair as well? And he's told, oh no, Sophocles is extremely reverent towards Aeschylus. He's extremely unassuming. When he came down here, he greeted Aeschylus like a long-lost brother and said, keep the chair yourself. So that is an interesting little nugget, again, about how Sophocles' character was perceived in 5th century Athens. As I mentioned in the lecture on Sophocles, he apparently was an extremely pleasant man. Well, the contest between Aeschylus and Euripides over which one is the better tragedian is also a contest over which one did more for Athens. And it becomes, in effect, a contest between the good old days and the present of 405. Aeschylus is an old-fashioned tragedian. His language, his meter, his poetry, his presentation are all very old-fashioned. But Aeschylus is also someone who fought at the Battle of Marathon. And the men who fought at Marathon were considered, I suppose the closest parallel in our culture would be to say they were considered the greatest generation. They were looked back to with the same kind of admiration, the same kind of almost awe at their abilities, their patriotism, their courage, their accomplishment that we now tend to look back on the veterans of World War II with. And so Aeschylus is the spokesman for an old-fashioned style of tragedy, but he also represents the old-fashioned virtues of the generation that won the Battle of Marathon. Euripides represents the war-weary Athenians of the present generation. Remember, this is 405, just 1 year before Athens' final defeat, as well as representing a newer, more innovative style of playwriting. Euripides represents the whole new generation of Athenians who are tied up in this terrible war and who do not seem to have the virtues that their grandfathers had at Marathon. The contest between the two tragedians builds to an extremely funny actual weighing of lines. They each put lines in either pan of a scale to see which one is the weightier author. And of course, Aeschylus's lines consistently come down as weightier than Euripides' lines. The result is that Dionysus chooses to resurrect Aeschylus rather than Euripides. Euripides objects. Dionysus had come down to Hades promising to take Euripides back, and Euripides basically says, how dare you? You came down to get me, and now you're taking this old geezer back instead. What's with that? And Dionysus answers Euripides by quoting an infamous line from Hippolytus at him. In the play Hippolytus, in Euripides' Hippolytus, that we looked at in the lecture on Euripides, when the nurse has first told Hippolytus about Phaedra's passion for him, she reminds Hippolytus, before I told you, you promised me that you would not pass on what I was about to say to you to anyone else. And Hippolytus says, my tongue swore, but my heart or my mind remained unpledged. Now, in the play Hippolytus actually does keep his word to the nurse. He doesn't tell anyone else, even at the cost of his own life, Phaedra's secret. But that line, my tongue swore, but my mind remained unpledged, became infamous because it seems to sum up those same anxieties that Athenians had about the sophists. What you do with someone who says one thing but thinks or means another. And so this line of Euripides, despite the fact that the character in the play, Hippolytus, did not actually act on that line, this line apparently haunted Euripides for the rest of his life. And here in Frogs, Dionysus responds to Euripides saying, but you promised you'd take me. Dionysus responds with one of Euripides' own most famous or infamous lines, my tongue swore, but my mind remained unpledged. Now, under its very, very funny storyline, Frogs is strong evidence that tragedy played a very serious social role in Athens, and that the mood of the city in 405 was anything but optimistic, and rightly enough, as we know from subsequent events. A desire to recapture the ethos of the men who won the Persian War, to turn the clock back 50 years or more, is very, very understandable, actually to turn the clock back more like 80 years, as the Peloponnesian War moves towards its end. The play captured the mood of the day so well that the audience voted Aristophanes a crown of sacred olive and ordered that the play be given a second performance, which was truly extraordinary. As you'll remember from the first lecture on tragedy and on Aeschylus, plays generally were performed only once. Some of Aeschylus's plays were reperformed after his death, but to vote a second performance for Frogs right then, at the time when it was first performed, is truly extraordinary. As our last representative of old comedy, Frogs is a fitting valediction to the 5th century, to Athenian culture in the 5th century, and to the high point of Athenian literature. Now, Aristophanes wrote 2 more plays that have survived. Ecclesiazusae, which means women in the assembly, and Plutus, which means wealth. These are our only extant examples of middle comedy. The term middle comedy was invented by Alexandrian scholars to explain the undeniable changes that we observe between Aristophanes' works and the works of Menander some 60 years later. Since so very little of this genre has survived, it's difficult to say much at all about it, but we can notice a few structural differences between Aristophanes' last 2 plays, his 2 middle comedies, and his earlier ones. Most noticeably, the role of the chorus is very greatly reduced, and the parabasis disappears. So the formal elements of old comedy are on the way out. How much the works of other comic authors in the 4th century resembled Aristophanes' last 2 plays will remain a matter of conjecture unless and until we find a complete or mostly complete manuscript of someone else's middle comedy. In general, it seems that Middle Comedy was less concerned with political and personal satire than Old Comedy had been, though these elements are by no means absent. They're much, much less foregrounded. The fragments of other Middle Comedies, that is, other comedies aside from the two by Aristophanes, tend to indicate an interest in domestic life and especially in food, in dining and eating. But this may be a matter of selection. This is one of the problems we get into in evaluating fragments. Most of our fragments of Middle Comedy occur in a work called Deipnosophistae, which basically means intellectuals at dinner, by a writer Athenaeus writing around AD 200. Now that's a literary account of a dinner party. So what are the people in this literary account of a dinner party likely to quote? Quotations about dinners. And so whether that is as foregrounded in Middle Comedy as these quotations make it seem, or whether this is just a matter of selection of those quotations, we really can't be sure. Well, in this lecture we have looked at comedy, Old and Middle, and particularly at Aristophanes. In our next lecture, we'll turn to a genre that shares elements from both history and drama. Plato's dialogues are written in prose like history, but they present themselves as interplays between characters like drama. And so it's to Plato that we'll turn in our next lecture.